Go for it.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Synergy Tech Talks Product Update. My name is Cindy Lindberg. I'm Customer Success Manager at Synergex, and I'll be facilitating today. A couple items to note before we get started. The first is that the webinar will be recorded today, and we'll publish that on our YouTube channel. So if you are a subscriber there, then you will get a notice when that's available. The other note is that we are going to be saving questions for the end of the webinar, but we invite you to type your questions in anytime during the presentation into the Q&A section of the screen, and then that will put your questions in the queue for the end of the event. Our speaker today is Steve Ives. Steve is a senior professional services consultant here at Synergex. He's also a member of our product management team that defines future development paths for our products. And now I'll turn the session over to Steve.
Okay, thank you, Cindy. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Just so that you're aware, right now I'm sitting in the dining room of my former childhood home in Northern England, and without access to the levels of internet bandwidth that I generally enjoy. So fingers crossed there should be enough to get a smooth audio and video feed out to you. We're here today to talk about a Synergy product update. The primary goal of this webinar is to present you with product update information so that you can keep up to date with all of the exciting things that are happening in the world of Synergy development. I'll be talking to you about changes that have been made in our release procedures and version numbering schemes, and catching you up on the details of recent current and future versions of the Synergy DE and Synergy DBL integration for Visual Studio products, or SDE and SDI as we tend to call them. Later in the webinar, I also have a few questions for you. There are several things that we're planning to do in the products over the coming months and years, and we'd like to give you an opportunity to provide us with your feedback on some of these things before those plans get finalized. And finally, we're excited to be able to share some information about some new and upcoming changes in services available from Synergex in a couple of specific areas. So let's get started. Let's dig in. To get started, the first thing I'd like to do is briefly review some of the procedural changes that have been made recently. A little over a year ago, we introduced the concept of LTS and feature releases as something that we were planning on implementing. Well, as many of you may already know, that implementation is now complete. There are now two distinct types of Synergy DE releases. They are called long-term support, or LTS for short, releases, and feature releases. And I want to spend just a couple of minutes to make sure that you all understand the goals and characteristics of each of those types of release. So we'll do that on the next slide. We've also introduced a new versioning scheme for Synergy DE. The scheme uses the major and minor version numbers in the first two parts, with the minor version also indicating the type of release. So that's something to be aware of. That second digit, if it's an even number, that's basically telling you that that release is something called a feature release. And if that second digit is an odd number, so 12.1, for example, is the one being the odd number I'm talking about, that indicates to you that that's an LTS, or a long-term support release. So, for example, 12.0 releases that we're done with now, they were feature releases, and 12.1 is the LTS release. 12.2 will follow it shortly, which will be a whole nother set of feature releases. 12.3 will be an LTS release, and so on. Just so that you know, unless we happen to do another patch to the 11.1 series, which may or may not happen, depends on what happens in the coming months and in terms of bug fixes that become necessary or so on. Other than that, patch letters are now a thing of the past. So you won't see any patch letters, A, B, C, D, E in the 12 or later versions of Synergy. They've been now replaced essentially with auto-incrementing build numbers in the fourth part of the version number. The astute amongst you may have noticed that I've not yet mentioned that third digit in the version number. Unfortunately, we do know that many Synergy applications have code that parses the DBL version number, which has always been a 4-part version. So if we change the format significantly, we would without a doubt break software left, right, and center. So that third digit in the version number essentially is now meaningless. We don't use it for anything, but it will always be present and it will always be a 1. So just something to be aware of again. Another thing we want to make everybody aware of is that the release cycle of the SDI, or the Visual Studio integration, Synergy DBL integration for Visual Studio product, is no longer tied to any specific SDE release. And to reinforce that message, we've also changed the version numbering scheme that we use with SDI to be something completely different. We now use a year.month.build number scheme for the SDI releases. And that really achieves 2 things. Firstly, it makes it clear that there is no direct dependency on any particular SDE release. And it also makes it very easy to know at a glance the age of the development tools that you're using. As always, we want to actively encourage all of our Synergy developers to develop using the very latest versions of the development tools, and keep your development tools up to date. So taking each SDI release as it comes, upgrading really only takes 2 or 3 minutes these days. And if necessary, using runtime version targeting to produce binary software compatible with older Synergy runtimes that may be present on customer or production systems. It's also worth noting that the SDI development tools do not participate in the LTS release strategy. SDI releases will continue to come thick and fast, with every release typically including both quality improvements and new and enhanced functionality. Let's talk a little bit, just for a couple of minutes, to make sure that you all understand the differences between LTS releases and feature releases, because it is quite important that you do so. They are somewhat different. LTS releases are essentially a brand new thing for us. They're kind of a layer above anything we've done in the past. They're designed to provide a very stable platform with regard to features and quality, and for an extended period of time. So LTS releases will occur on a known cadence, with a new LTS release being published approximately every 2 years. And LTS releases also have an extended window of support that will last at least 4 years for each LTS release. So once published, updates to an LTS release will only contain quality improvements and security patches if necessary, but never any new or enhanced features. Feature releases, on the other hand, are similar to how we historically released software. They provide access to new features and new functionality as soon as that feature or function is ready to go and has been made available from our development teams. I do want to stress, though, that feature releases are not beta releases. They are fully tested and fully qualified for use in all scenarios to the best of our ability. But of course, the presence of new code can, in some cases, lead to the presence of new bugs. But that was always the case. Feature releases do have a shorter period of support, though, with support ending just 3 months after the next feature release, or the LTS release that terminates the series of feature releases. So if you do elect to use feature releases, and if you do subsequently have a problem that requires a software fix from us, the delivery mechanism for that fix will be for you to take the next feature release in the series, or the LTS release if that's what comes next. Let's briefly just review recent Synergy releases, and this is where you'll start to see some of these LTS and feature releases happening. So in recent months, there have been 3 Synergy DE releases, and really in recent months, I'm talking about the last 6 months or so, about 6. The first one I'll mention, if for no other reason than to reinforce how feature releases lead up to and culminate in an LTS release, was our very first feature release, which was version 12.013272 was the build number of this one. So 12.0, saying this is the version 12 feature release series. that's going to lead up to the 12.1 LTS release. So this feature release was released back in September of 2021 and actually contained most of the changes that were intended to become part of the 12.1 LTS release going forward. That release was downloaded and tested by several customers, and we thank them for jumping in and on board at that early stage. Next came the final, probably, Synergy 11 release. So Synergy 11.1.1i. It was released in November of 2021. Even though 11.1 is not technically an LTS release, you can kind of think of it as being the final update to the previous LTS in terms of it is a highly stable environment. As most of you will know, we stopped delivering new features in letter patches some time ago now. So the last several 11.1 releases have been quality improvement releases as well, and 11.1.1i is the culmination of all of that work, and it really is a very stable environment to work in. The one thing that, other than that with 11.1.1i was it did also add support for 2 new platforms, those being Windows 11 and Windows Server 2022. On that subject, things are a little bit different this time. If you do intend to install on Windows 11 or Server 2022, and if you do have any Synergy Windows or UI Toolkit code, including in our products like Report Writer and Repository and places like that, then you will pretty much need to upgrade to 11.1.1i as you go to Windows 11 or Server 2022. Or you can achieve the same thing by going to the 3.2.7.5 feature release or the recently released 12.1.1 LTS. All of those 3 things will work fine on Windows 11 and Server 2022. But earlier versions probably will not. This is because very late in the game, Microsoft changed some very low-level screen painting functions deep in the Windows operating system, and those changes impacted how input fields got painted and resulted in some pretty noticeable bleed-through effects happening around input fields as well as various other places in the UI. So 11.1.1i is pretty much a requirement this time for the latest Windows operating system. The third and final recent prior release I'll mention is the SDE 12.0.1.3.2.7.5. Again, this was a feature release made available in mid-February. February the 15th to be exact, and it represented a code complete environment. And this is again very typical. Once we've finished working on a set of new features for a long-term support release, there'll be a final feature release, which is essentially code complete and gives customers a final chance to test new features and so on. So again, once again, this feature release was adopted by a considerable number of developers who took the opportunity to verify their software in that environment. In terms of current releases, what's out there to be downloaded and used right now, well, right now, things are a little bit different to how they will be most of the time. What I mean by that is generally there will be 2 concurrently available versions of Synergy, the current LTS version and the current feature release version. But right now, as we've just released the LTS release, and we have not yet started releasing the next series of feature releases that will over time build up to the feature set of the next LTS in 2 years' time. So for now on, for this point in time, for an interim period, there's just that one version of Synergy that is essentially the current product. That version is Synergy DE 12.1.1.3.2.7.8 LTS, which was released on all supported platforms just a few days ago on the 1st of April. As an LTS release, the feature set of that release is now set in stone. There may be updates to that to that release, but if, as I've already mentioned, if so, those updates will only contain bug fixes or address any security issues, or possibly add platform support if necessary, but no new features and no changes to features in the LTS release going forward. And of course, we have the current SDI release, so the Visual Studio tools. The current version there is 2022-04 and the build number 1114. And we've had several this year. I think we're up to about 4 SDI releases this year so far. Each one of them addressing quality issues and adding new features as we go. As always, we recommend that all Synergy developers use Visual Studio and the SDI tools, and always use the latest and greatest version in conjunction with runtime version targeting, if necessary, to target those older deployment runtimes. In terms of what's coming up, at the current time, I don't have any concrete plans to tell you about. We've just finished a major development cycle. But in the Synergy, Synergy DE world, there are likely to be further 12.1 LTS quality improvement releases over time. We're aware of at least one additional platform which we will be adding to the 12.1 environment, which is support for Synergy.net applications running under .NET 6 on Linux. This support will be initially specifically for deploying Harmony Core services running under .NET 6 on Linux, and will subsequently be extended to other Synergy.net applications in due course. You can also expect to see an initial 12.2 feature release at some point in the upcoming months. But again, we don't have any specific information on that at this point in time. We're still in the planning phase regarding what the set of features will be for the next LTS release in 2 years' time. And those feature releases will start dribbling out those features as we define them and start developing them. So no concrete plans as yet. As always, though, expect regular SDI, the Visual Studio tooling updates throughout the year. We are also actively working on defining the roadmap for SDI for the coming months. And I think it's fair to say we have some really great ideas about what to do next. We're not quite ready to go public with those just yet, but watch this space. We've got some exciting news coming in that regard. So let's talk a little bit about what Synergy 12 actually is, and what's in there and what's different and what's available to you now. As we announced quite a long time ago now, I think almost a couple of years ago, this release was primarily about adding support for .NET 6, formerly known as .NET Core, as an alternative to .NET Framework in all of the places where Synergy and .NET touch. So, for example, all of the statements, routines, and classes that we support when using Synergy.net, traditional Synergy APIs like the .NET Assembly API, XFNetlink.net, and all of the APIs and libraries that were previously available through add reference in the .NET Framework world will be available from NuGet.org as a NuGet package for use in the .NET 6 world. One difference to be aware of is that we do not support developing Windows Forms or WPF applications in Synergy.net in the .NET 6 environment. There are two reasons for this. The main reason is Microsoft actually blocked third-party vendors from using the necessary tooling in Visual Studio. But secondly, there's really just no demand for us doing so, with almost no exceptions in our user base. People create their desktop UI using C# and VB and access their Synergy code and data via assembly references, XF Server Plus, or web services, and that's entirely consistent with how we think things should be done. The next thing to be aware of is, in addition to supporting .NET 6, we've also created a new version of the XFNetlink.net client, and this client is built against .NET Standard 2.0. So this means that the same version of the package can be used not only from .NET Framework from 4.6.1 to 4.8 versions of the framework, but it can also be used from .NET Core from version 2 through 3.1, and it can also be used in .NET 5 and .NET 6 applications. So this gives .NET developers much more flexibility to use the client to access Synergy logic and data from many additional applications and environments. The new client is code compatible with the earlier .NET Framework only client. The older client is still available, by the way. You can still download and install the XFNetlink.net installations for Framework only. but the new clients are code compatible, so there should be no code changes required. It's simply a case of removing the package reference to the old framework assembly and replacing it with a NuGet reference to the new .NET Standard package from NuGet. If your .NET application utilized COM+ pooling to pool and share xfnetlink.NET components, then please note that COM+ pooling is not available in .NET Core, .NET 5, or .NET 6. So to fulfill that requirement, we've provided classes in the NuGet package that enable you to implement pooling within your application in a very similar way to the way that xfnetlink Java connection pooling was always implemented. Implementing pooling, therefore, does require some code changes in your server application, but those code changes are relatively minor, and rest assured that the overall functionality of the new pooling mechanism is highly compatible with the way that COM+ pooling operated. So it supports the same set of pool support methods, meaning that changes to your backend XF Server Plus environment should not be necessary. There are also some details and some examples both in the documentation, and we have a little sample application that we can make available that sort of demonstrates how to implement pooling in a simple ASP.NET web application, for example, in .NET 6 or .NET Core, I believe it was, but same thing. Okay, let's move on. Another important feature in Synergy 12.1 is the addition of TCP/IP-based licensing for Linux systems. This is optional, but if you do select it, there will still be a local license server process on your Linux system, but rather than maintaining its own licenses in an LMDB file, the license manager process on Linux will communicate over the network with a Windows license server. It will then consume the same pool of license keys as other Windows and/or Linux systems, accessing that same license server. By the way, this is only supported if you're using subscription licensing. There are several advantages to using network-based licensing on Linux systems. Not only the fact that it really simplifies license management and enables shared concurrent use licensing across multiple Windows and/or Linux systems. We've had shared concurrent use on Windows for forever, but never on Linux before. They always had specific licenses for each Linux system. It's also great for development environments, as developers can now have a licensed server on their development system and attach and spin up any number of Linux and/or Windows systems and/or VMs on demand and without having to independently license each of those systems. You just point them all at your development license server and off they go. But perhaps the most important impact of this change is that it removes a significant block that previously prevented Synergy applications from running in containers, for example, in Docker containers, perhaps managed in Kubernetes clusters. This in turn opens up many new possibilities for Synergy applications, including the possibility of deploying Synergy applications to native public cloud scenarios. In Synergy 12, we've also changed how we implement encryption on Windows. We now use Secure Channel, or S-Channel as it tends to be referred to, which is part of the Windows operating system instead of OpenSSL. So there are many benefits to doing this, not least of which is that on Windows, developers no longer need to download and deploy OpenSSL DLLs to use encryption, no longer need to maintain cryptographic certificates on disk in PEM files, and no longer need to create and manage and specify certification authority or CA files in order to make HTTPS calls securely. No code changes are required to take advantage of this new encryption provider, as all required changes have been made internally without altering the signatures of any routines. However, there are some optional changes that you might want to consider making to your code or procedures to reduce the overhead required to manage certificates and CA files going forward. The first change that you might want to consider relates to configuring XF Server or XF Server Plus to use encrypted connections. Previously, there were two ways to do this, using the rsyndy utilities -cert command line option, or using the enable encryption and certificate file fields in the service configuration dialogues of the Synergy configuration program. These mechanisms previously allowed you to provide a file system path to a certificate, requiring the certificate to first be exported from the Windows Certificate Store to a PEM file. While this is still supported, a new syntax allows you to refer to the certificate directly in the Windows Certificate Store. There are two variations of this new syntax, one specifying the store location and common name, and one specifying the store location and thumbprint of the certificate that you wish to use. A similar scenario exists when implementing encryption with the SQL OpenNet protocol used by the SQL Connection and XFODBC products. This time, encryption is activated with the -E option of the VTXNetD or VTXNet2 commands. And once again, a Windows certificate store path can serve as an alternative to a PEM file spec. And finally, another change to consider is a slight change when using the Synergy HTTP API to make secure HTTPS calls to websites or services. Previously, to make HTTPS calls securely, it was necessary to provide a certification authorities or CA file. A certification authority is a trusted external entity from which cryptographic certificates may be purchased or otherwise obtained. The CA file you provide contains one or more certificates that identify those certification authorities whose issued certificates you are willing to trust. Of course, this is a tough decision to make, so most developers defer to a trusted external entity such as Microsoft, which maintains such a list of trusted entities as part of the Windows operating system, primarily for use in the web browsers such as Internet Explorer and Edge. Developers would use typically a Windows utility to export the Windows Certificate Store's trusted root certification authorities list into a file, and then use a utility such as OpenSSL to convert that file into a format acceptable to the Synergy HTTP API. Of course, this is an operation that should occur regularly, as this list of trusted entities and their associated certificates does change periodically. Once again, this mechanism is still supported, but in Synergy 12, a much simpler alternative is simply to pass the literal value cert_store to the CA file parameter of the various HTTP API routines. Doing so instructs the Synergy runtime to validate the certificates directly against the trusted root certification authorities list in the Windows Certificate Store. Another related change is somewhat more wide-ranging, and it affects all platforms apart from OpenVMS at this time. Starting with Synergy 12.1, please be aware that cryptographic certificates now get validated for authenticity, revocation, and expiration before use. This validation did not previously occur, and this means that there is a possibility that some existing deployments could be running with untrusted, revoked, or expired certificates. In fact, we know that this is the case. With XF Server, XF Server Plus, and SQL OpenNet, certificate validation occurs during the startup of the service. So in such a scenario, upgrading to Synergy 12.1 could break an existing environment, as, for example, instances of those services might fail to restart during the upgrade because the certificate is bad. It may have expired, for example. This change could also impact secure HTTPS communications using the various HTTP API routines as well. So to head off any problems, what we're recommending is that you perform an audit of any cryptographic certificates used in your environment before you upgrade to Synergy 12. And just make sure that those certificates are from a trusted source, or in the case of a self-signed certificate, have been registered as trusted. For example, by putting them into the Trusted Root Certification Authorities list on Windows. Processes and procedures vary on various other Linux and Unix operating systems, so refer to the operating system documentation on how to trust self-signed certificates. You also should make sure that any certificates have not been revoked since they were issued, although that is fairly rare, and have not expired. And that's probably the main one. You know, a lot of us are using self-signed certificates to do our encryption with our processes like XF Server. And there is a good chance that, you know, those things do have expiry dates that were never checked before. So there's a good chance that some of you out there are using expired certificates. If you've not already done so, we also recommend implementing an ongoing process designed to ensure the replacement of those certificates before they expire. You know, they do have a lifetime and they should be replaced before that lifetime expires. If the worst case comes to the worst and you do encounter an invalid certificate in a production scenario, we have provided a kind of emergency escape hatch to get you up and running quickly. Specifically, the RSIND, VTXNetD, and VTXNet2 utilities have a new command line option, which is -inv cert OK, invalid certificate OK. And for XF Server and XF Server Plus, the Synergy configuration program also has a new checkbox that says allow startup with an invalid certificate, which essentially restores the previous earlier behavior. Using either of these options makes it possible to start an XF Server or XF Server Plus service, even with an invalid certificate, like I mentioned, as was previously the case. Just want to briefly talk about the integration with Visual Studio. It's been a busy year. We've had several new SDI releases, I think 8 or 9 in the last calendar year. And in turn, many of those have introduced several developer-focused new features, some of which you can see listed on the slide. I'm not going to go through all of those items on the slide. One of the more significant new features in a recent release made it easier for UI toolkit developers, believe it or not. We've added a new project template that allows you to create projects to manage your UI toolkit window script files and compile them into the necessary window libraries for your application. We did invite several customers to collaborate with us on the design and implementation of this new feature, and we'd like to thank them for their valuable input and for helping us test the new functionality before the initial release. I won't mention any names, but you know who you are, and we are very grateful. Adoption of SDI has continued to increase, although perhaps not as quickly as we would like. We think everybody should be using Visual Studio tools for all Synergy development, essentially. We're not done yet. SDI is very much an ongoing process and probably always will be. As I mentioned earlier, we do have some exciting things in mind to make it even better. In terms of Visual Studio versions, just a quick note about that. As a policy and a general rule, we always support the current and one prior major release of Visual Studio, which means that we currently support Visual Studio 2022 and 2019. Although there is a requirement on 2019, it has to be a certain level. I think it's 16.9 or higher for the internal version number. And we also support the command line only build tools packages of both of those versions for automated build systems, CI/CD systems, and so on. Support for Visual Studio 2017 was dropped in November when we added 2022 support. At this point, I would say most developers are still using some flavor of 2019, but adoption of 2022 is ramping up pretty fast now. If you're not aware, Visual Studio 2022 is for the first time built as a 64-bit product, and as a result has access to much more memory than it ever had before, which was its biggest constraint. This in turn just makes things feel faster, more responsive. For example, starting up and opening large solutions is noticeably snappier than it was before. Build times have not really been impacted because that's largely down to the individual compilers being used, but SDI and the compiler team have made significant strides forward in that regard in recent months and years. So if you're not using the latest versions of our tools in Visual Studio, I strongly recommend going and updating. Like I say, you don't need to be concerned about the version of Synergy you're targeting to on production because you can use runtime version targeting. And using the latest and greatest tools, if you're not, if you're a little bit behind, I suspect you'll notice a difference. Personally, I'm now using 2022 exclusively, and I've uninstalled all of my 2019 instances, and I'm very happy. By the way, if you are planning on doing any .NET 6 development, and that will very soon include Harmony Core, as we're about to update Harmony Core to .NET 6 in the very near future, you must use Visual Studio 2022. Microsoft do not support doing .NET 6 development in any older version of the IDE. On the subject of Harmony Core, let me give you a brief update to that. I would like to take this opportunity to tell you that Harmony Core development is going great. As most of you will already know, Harmony Core is our open source and standards-based web services platform. It's designed specifically to make it very easy for Synergy developers to expose their application's data and business logic via RESTful web services APIs and powerful OData protocols that can be used by almost any other application or development environment, in addition to standard data analysis, dashboarding, and reporting tools like Microsoft Excel and the Power Platform apps such as Microsoft Power BI. Harmony Core development is a continuous process. We continue to add new features and extend functionality to meet customer requirements. We have recently completed a migration from .NET Core 3.1 to .NET 6, although that that work has not yet been published. So we are doing internal testing with it. We've converted most of the customer projects that we have access to .NET 6 and successfully verified the environment, and it will be getting published fairly soon. We're also excited to then, once it is published, be able to take advantage of various new capabilities in, for example, the .NET 6 entity framework that will in turn allow us to add several new features to the Harmony Core environment over the coming months. And very soon now, as I mentioned earlier, it will finally become possible for developers with Linux-based Synergy applications to host their Harmony Core services directly on their Linux systems without requiring that intermediate Windows server to host the web services. We've already had our first boot of such an environment, and the results from that testing were very, very encouraging. In terms of adoption, several customers are now using Harmony Core services in full-blown production environments, and countless others are at various stages of experimentation and implementation with Harmony Core services. I should also mention that our professional services team have also now successfully completed several Harmony Core implementation projects for various customers. So if you need direct assistance with building and rolling out RESTful web services APIs, then those services are definitely available from PSG. At this point, we feel very comfortable recommending Harmony Core as the recommended solution in a wide range of scenarios, including but not limited to building new client-server applications, integrating third-party solutions with Synergy applications, and even modernizing existing XF Server Plus and XF Netlink environments. A lot of effort has gone in recent months to being able to do just that, and we're now at the point where if you do have an existing XF Server Plus environment, we can code generate directly off your repository and Synergy method catalog and expose your existing Synergy XF Server Plus backends via RESTful APIs with very little effort. These are the questions that we've been asking as we've been having some meetings with specific customers in recent weeks and months. We've been asking for the feedback. In this forum, we're going to do it a little bit differently. So I'm just going to go through several things that we would like to get some feedback from you guys on. And then at the end of the webinar, as Cindy will go over it with you, but you will receive an email with an opportunity to give us some feedback in these specific areas. So let me just explain the background of some of these things, and you will have the opportunity to answer the questions a little bit later. So the first thing is exception handling. We are planning to automatically write unhandled exceptions, so unhandled errors, program's going to crash, right, to the system's event log. So the Windows event log, Linux or Unix sys log, or OpenVMS operator log. Currently in traditional Synergy, unhandled exceptions are simply not logged at all. So if you don't catch an exception, the program crashes and there's nowhere to go to find out any information if you miss that traceback on the screen, if there is a screen. So with this change, you would be able to go to the event log and look back and see what happened and see the traceback and all of that kind of thing. This already happens in Synergy.net, so this is traditional Synergy that we're talking about. So our question is, do you have any concerns about this? Do you think this is a good idea? If you have any feedback about us doing that, then please let us know in the survey at the end. The next thing that we'd like some feedback on specifically is specifically .NET related. So .NET runtime version targeting. we are planning on raising the minimum runtime version targeting version from its current 10.11d, which is a version that was released in August of 2014, to version 10.3.1b, which was a release from pretty much exactly 1 year later, so August 2015. With the benefit of hindsight, we now realize that some of those earlier runtimes were of a much lower quality in some areas, and we feel that the 10.3.1b and higher runtimes represent a much higher level of quality that really should be used in production systems. And like I say, this is going back, so the minimum would be software that was released essentially almost 7 years ago at this point. So the question is, will that cause you any problems? Do you have, older versions of Synergy.net code out there, or Synergy, installations? Do you have customer installations or production system installations that are older than 10.3.1b and running Synergy.net software? If so, would it be painful for you to upgrade to at least 10.3.1b or higher? So give us any feedback if you have any concerns in that specific area. The next one is we are planning to start automatically collecting some metrics from Visual Studio initially development systems. Ultimately, one day this might be the compiler on other platforms, but right now we're talking Visual Studio. The information collected would primarily be for us and would be reported back to us via Microsoft's Azure App Insights platform, which is the same mechanism that Visual Studio already reports considerable amounts of telemetry information back to Microsoft. The frequency and overhead of doing so would be minimal. You should not notice an impact of this at all. Initially, we are planning on collecting information about failures in the product. So if there is an issue in Visual Studio that's causing errors, we would automatically notify us, so we would know about those failures without you having to report them to us. And also, we would like to know what features of our product you guys are using, particularly when we release new features. We want to use this information to be able to target our development dollars more intelligently in the areas that we know that most of our customers are using. The information that we collected would be non-identifiable to individuals. We would like to know which company and development system the data comes from, probably by transmitting a hash of the system's unique license ID. So ultimately, we would know which company it came from, and we would be able to group reports that came from the same system, although we wouldn't know anything about that system other than these 10 errors, for example, all came from the same machine. The most important thing about this is there would be an opt-in mechanism that would be either part of the installer or more likely when you first use the version of Visual Studio and SDI that has these tools in, there would be some kind of UI that tells you what's happening, tells you what's being reported, and gives you the opportunity to opt in or not. And if you do opt in, there will be a tools options way of going and undoing that and opting out subsequently. Also, this is just web services, so an organization absolutely could block this at the firewall if necessary. So our questions are, do you have any concerns about that? And if so, give us details about what your concerns are. On my slides, it's saying let us know via your account manager, but as I mentioned, Cindy's put together an email survey that you'll get after the webinar. By the way, we are also planning on adding some more metrics to the product, adding the ability to collect various statistics from runtime systems. In this case, this data would be collected entirely for your own use, not reported back to us in any way. This data would be recorded only in local log files. Initially, we're thinking that we probably have mechanisms to allow you to collect information such as how much CPU time are you consuming, how much memory are you consuming, how many IOs are you performing, how many licenses are you consuming, and high watermarks for licensing and things like that. None of that would happen unless you specifically go and enable that feature through some mechanism. So I'm not expecting any objections in this area, but if any of you do have any concerns there, or more importantly, if you have suggestions over what kind of information you would find it useful to be able to collect, Having this kind of information available is fairly critical if you're looking at virtualizing systems, for example, and particularly if you're looking at moving to the cloud. If to get any reasonable chance of sizing cloud resources correctly, these are the kind of statistics that you need access to. On the subject of cloud, our final question, not really a question, but just a call to action is probably more accurate, related to future developments related to migrating applications to native cloud or public cloud scenarios. Obviously, this can mean a lot of different things to different people, and there are literally hundreds of different types of native cloud services. But as we discussed earlier, we think that containerization is going to become a key strategy for many. So we're already working on that aspect, but also we'd really like to have conversations with you about what your cloud migrations look like in the future, or even if you're just having doing research and exploring the possibilities, please have the conversation with us and involve us, because we'd very much like to learn what our customers' goals are. We know we want to do some, or we know we need to do some cloud stuff in the product, but we're trying to figure out exactly what that means yet. So I'm not looking for an answer for this right now, but please bear us in mind as you do have those discussions in your companies. Call us up and let's have a chat. Right now, there is one question that you may be able to answer, which is if you already have a preferred public cloud vendor. So is it Azure? Is it Google? Is it AWS, Amazon, and so on? Please let us know what that preferred vendor is, and if there are any specific reasons why. We'd be very interested in learning that, so that we can again focus our attention where it makes most sense. Okay, a couple of things about services. Very pleased to be able to tell you that we are announcing the availability of an online version of the DBL Essentials or DBL Language Essentials class. This is a former 5-day instructor-led class that has been re-implemented by an experienced instructional designer and using a professional learning management system similar to those used for distance learning by many leading colleges and universities. The class has been reworked as a series of short videos, activities, quizzes, and incorporates mental breaks to prevent overwhelming the student. During the class, students work in Visual Studio and use traditional Synergy to create a very simplified order entry type application. The class has been developed over almost 2 years, or redeveloped over almost 2 years, and has completed its testing phases both internally, and the first paying customers are now using the service. The cost of the class is $2,000 per student. Students will have access to the class materials for a period of time, I think up to 1 year. Multi-student discounts are available, so talk to your account manager if you need more information about this. We're hoping that many of you will make this online class a standard part of your onboarding process when employing and training new developers. The next thing I would like to make you aware of, although a lot of you already are, looking at the people in the audience, I want to let you know that we have a new regular series of webinars called Synergy Tech Talks that have essentially replaced the previous Harmony Core Office Hours webinars. We've widened the scope to cover all of the Synergy products. So each webinar will be hosted by a panel of Synergex representatives, including myself, our CTO, Jeff Green, our development managers, Marty Lewis and Tim Bogus, representatives from our education and developer support teams, and others, including, of course, the account execs and managers that you deal with on a regular basis. We'll generally kick off each of these sessions with brief updates on things like SDE and SDI and Harmony Core and Code Gen and any other topics that are relevant at the time. And then we'll open the floor to answer any questions that you may have about anything you want to talk about Synergy related. So, bring your questions, be ready to, unmute your mic and speak up and ask those questions, and let's get a community going and help people along. The webinars tend to be scheduled or are scheduled for 1 hour every 6 weeks, although typically they don't run the full hour. Typically they may run 25, 30 minutes. I want to encourage you all to sign up via the website, attend, and bring any questions you may have. Signing up, all it means is you will get the email a couple of days before reminding you that there's a webinar. There's no commitment to join, but we hope you will. Finally, in terms of services and events, we have made it to the final slide. I'm pleased to inform you all that we will be offering a Dev Partner Conference later in the year. Dates have not been finalized yet, but it will most likely be in mid to late September. This will once again be an online event following much the same format as the previous conference last year in 2021. We are currently working on detailed plans, including putting together what we hope will be an amazing agenda of sessions for you all to attend. If you do have any suggestions for what you'd really like to see in a conference session, then this would be a great time to speak up. So once again, if you do have any ideas, please let us know through your account managers. It's probably a great way of doing that. With that, I'm going to, that's the formal part of my presentation done. Cindy, do we have any questions?
I don't see any questions yet. So if anybody does have any questions, feel free to type them in.
Yeah, that would be a good time. Let me turn that screen off. There we go. So, any questions, anybody? Everybody's very quiet as usual. See, Cindy, we've obviously done an excellent job and provided absolutely the information that people were hoping to see, and everybody's good.
You did a great job.
Thank you.
A lot of good information.
Yep, I'm not seeing any questions at all. Oh, there's one. Oh, it's Kim saying thanks for the updates. You're welcome, Kim.
Well, of course, if you have any questions, you can follow up with your account manager, or like Steve said, I'll be sending out a follow-up email with some questions. So feel free to send us questions anytime. I just looking at the what's coming into the Q&A, but
LTS, how many years does it cover? So an LTS release, basically the clock starts ticking the day it goes out the door. And the support rules for an LTS release are that it will be a minimum of 4 years from the date of release, and possibly longer. The only reason it would be longer is if the subsequent LTS release is significantly delayed, but that's unlikely to be the case. So typically it's a 4 years from date of release.
Thank you for that question. Any others before we wrap it up? Okay, well, thank you all for joining us today. We really appreciate you making the time. And like Steve said, we hope you'll join us for future Tech Talks. You can find information on our website, and we'll also be sending advertisements for those. And with that, I hope to see you next time. Okay. Have a great rest of your day.
Goodbye, everyone.